I'm recording my homily for Easter of 2019, and the reality is my homily is actually a compilation of several homilies I gave through Holy Week, through the Triduum, and the reality is because I was kind of running on fumes, my homilies tended to really blend together. I started repeating myself quite a bit, but I'm going to give a couple of those themes and just kind of bring them all together. So one of the things I talked about, as you journey through the Triduum, you start with Jesus' day when he's coming into Jerusalem in that triumphal entry, right? And then a couple days later, he's having that Last Supper with his disciples, and then that night he's arrested, etc., right? So one of the things I talked about this idea that in our world, there are two types of fire, okay? So you think of fire in the natural sense. The first type of fire is a fire that could occur naturally. It could be like a forest fire, or it could be a fire that burns down a house. If you've ever had a fire in your home, you know how traumatic that is. And fire is irrational. It just consumes. It just destroys, right? When fire is done, it leaves destruction. There's nothing left when it's done. And so, whenever you see someone who's gone through a fire, they're often sifting through the rubble to see if there's anything that the fire did not destroy. Okay? But the fire just simply destroys. At the Easter Vigil, in that evening, we begin Mass outside, and we begin with a fire, right? And if you were to go back outside to where the fire was after the Mass, all that's left is just ashes. So that type of fire is simply destructive. It just destroys. It takes something that was created and obliterates it, right? Okay, so in the spiritual life, we have that type of fire also. We call it sin. It can come in many different forms, but it just consumes and destroys whatever it touches. And so you think of sins that really lend themselves to spreading, like lies, right, or gossip. These are things that, as we go deeper with them, they spread and they just continue to destroy. When people have been hurt by other people's sins, it destroys, right? It leaves a wave of destruction. Okay, so like a fire. Okay, so that's the first type of fire. The second type of fire is the opposite, though. It's a type of fire that we use to create, right? So if you think of a forge is a place. It could be smaller, it could be big, but it's something that we use, and we put a fire inside of it, and we make that fire so hot that it can melt just about anything, right? So if you're trying to melt gold or steel or aluminum, whatever you're trying to melt, you put it inside this fire and it purifies it, right? You skim the top of it to get all the impurities off of it. So it purifies it, but it makes it so that we can mold it into something new. We can create from it. And that type of fire is powerful, it's beautiful, and it's creative. Okay? And so this is what Jesus Christ desires to do when he comes into the world. Now, when I was talking on Holy Thursday, I talked about these fires as almost being mutually exclusive. Like you have Jesus' fire over here that's creating, and you have the fire over here that's destroying, almost like they're separate. Okay? And the more I thought about it as we were journeying through Holy Week, the more I realized they are actually not separate in some ways. Okay? Before I get to that, though, one of the examples I used of fire that destroys was actually the church in Paris, so Notre Dame. So you remember, you've seen pictures of that church going up in flames, right? And you think to yourself, man, how senseless. And it was just an accident, right? So it's not necessarily like there was somebody to blame. It wasn't a terrorist act. It wasn't a sin that caused it. But the fire didn't care. Now, what the fire did care about was that there was fuel for the fire. Now, the church, in reality, if you know a little bit of history of it, the church was falling into disrepair. And so, yes, here it was one of the biggest tourist sites in France, definitely. But even in the world, one of the most beautiful structures that we've built, and almost 900 years old, but it was falling into disrepair. And several times throughout its life, it fell into disrepair. And in this last particular time, the government was fighting with the church on who should have to pay for the upkeep, right? Because it's a giant building, it needs to be repaired. But everybody's struggling to pay for it. It was like there was this shortage of money to keep it up. So they were finally beginning the repairs on it, but the accident happened in the midst of that, right? And so the fire then consumes this church and brings a lot of it to the ground. Jesus comes along and he observes the world with love, which means he notices the fires in our world. And again, I'm not talking here necessarily about churches burning or you think of 9/11 and buildings or terrorist acts on Easter, the horrible terrorist act in Sri Lanka. He's looking at the fires of sin and hate and you think of all the vices that are out there of lust and greed and all those things, envy, pride. He sees those fires burning. Where do those fires burn? They first burn within each of us. It's like if we were a church, we're a beautiful church, but if we fall into disrepair, then the horrible fire of sin begins to start within us, right? And then it spreads outward. And so Jesus sees those fires. It's like, we as human beings, we just notice when there's a fire, right? We can smell it, you can hear it, you can feel the heat of it. I noticed that at the Easter Vigil when I was trying to light the taper, whatever you call it, the stick. I was trying to light the stick to light the Easter candle, and I couldn't even get close enough. It was so hot, so I had to get really low. So we feel the fire when it's getting really hot, right? It's the same with sin. You can feel the effects of sin around us. So Jesus feels all of that. He hears it. He smells it. But then he doesn't run away, right? So the very nature of the cross is that he enters into that fire and he plants that cross like an anchor, right? He plants the cross right in the ground and he won't leave us. He will not abandon us. And so he allows, if you will, that fire to be there, but so that he can destroy it, so that he can obliterate it. Okay? That's the nature of him entering into the fire, of him dying, right? The resurrection is destroying that fire. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. Where was I going with that? I forgot where I was going with that. Anyways. Okay, so he enters into the fire, right? And he begins the process then of destroying. But he notices it, and then he begins to take it in, right? So it's like a firefighter. A firefighter notices the fire, evaluates the situation, and then has to enter into the fire in order to save people, right? Or in order to extinguish the fire. It has to enter into it. So Jesus does that also. Okay, so he's not afraid. I think this is a great lesson for us. So as Christians, the more virtue we begin to have in our lives, the more we begin to be attuned to smelling of the spiritual fires that are in our world. We begin to notice sin more. We become more, if you will, just attuned to it, right? And it's not that we should react and become afraid of it, but like firefighters, we become more skilled at putting those fires out. Okay? We become better at and more courageous, like a firefighter. We become more courageous. We can run into a fire to put it out rather than just stand back. Okay? All right. When he sees the fires, those spiritual fires beginning in each of us, he wants to transform it, and he wants to remind us that each and every one of us is like a forge, okay? We are meant to be the beautiful fire, the fire that creates. And so if that horrible fire is raging around it, he wants to take it all back in and create something beautiful. And so a fire that's meant to create. Now, let's look at just really quickly at what happens once he rises from the dead. So you remember Peter, right? So on Friday, Good Friday, Peter has a really bad day. Peter denies Jesus 3 times. And Jesus told him he was going to do it, and he still did it, right? And so you can imagine afterwards, how was Peter feeling? How would you feel, right? How do I feel when I've denied God in some manner in my life? You feel horrible. And so Easter Sunday morning, you can imagine Peter is feeling pretty low, but you can also imagine him hoping that there's some path to where he can repair what he's done, where what he destroyed in denying Jesus, he can somehow redeem. You know he's hoping for that because that's what we hope for. That's what was missing from Judas. He was missing that path to see that he could repair what he's done. It's never too late. It's never hopeless. And so Peter, you can imagine him praying intensely for a path, just for any path. And that's when Mary Magdalene comes bursting through the doors, right? So she went down to the tomb, her and some of the other women, and she comes back and she says, he's not there. Now the other apostles are thinking to themselves, so especially in the Gospel of Luke, they're thinking, well, that's nonsense, right? That's what the Gospel says. That's nonsense. But in Luke, when Peter's listening, he just takes off running, right? Maybe he's not perfect. Maybe he doesn't believe everything in this moment, but he takes off running. Now, in the Gospel of John, it's a little bit different, but Peter and John take off running, okay? But what's interesting with Peter is that he just beelines it to the tomb. Why do you think him? Because he had the greater need, right? He would have had this burning desire to be healed. John is younger than him and ran faster. And so John gets to the tomb, but he doesn't go inside right away. It's Peter who goes in immediately. John waits outside. Now, John was the one who didn't abandon Jesus. He stayed with him. And so in some sense, he perhaps didn't have this moment of desperate hope that Peter has. And so Peter runs into the tomb because he wants to know that there is no doubt that there is that path there, that everything Jesus said was truthful, was honest, was clear, and gives him the path. It's rather beautiful when you think about it. Here's an example of Peter and perhaps his impulsiveness getting it right, and so he runs into the tomb. Now, the other thing about Peter and John, they don't stay at the tomb. In other words, the context of their faith is not to go into the tomb and see the empty tomb and say, okay, now we're just going to stay here, right? They don't do that. They leave the tomb. Because now that this fire gets enkindled within him, this fire is enkindled, Peter can now go back. You remember the last thing Jesus tells Peter? He says, when you have turned, go back and strengthen my brothers. Go back and strengthen your brothers, right? And so once this forge is lit within him, and so his soul is now more on fire, he can go back and strengthen his brothers. And then once they get to Pentecost, he's going to go back and strengthen everybody else. He's going to burn with this fire. He's going to want to bring it to everybody. But how he took the fire of sin, his doubt, his pride, the fire that destroys, he allowed Jesus Christ to turn it into a fire that creates, purifies, right? So one of the things I love about Peter in all of this and him encountering the resurrection is that it gives him conviction. It's not conviction of being perfect or of being the super saint. It's the conviction of desperately needing Jesus. And that is something that every single person in our world can relate to at some point in their life, right? The second thing that happens once he has this conviction is that his behavior begins to change. And sometimes it'll even look to the world as being slightly crazy, but that's good. It's grace at work. He's not worried now about what other people think. And so if the woman comes up to him and says, "You're one of them," he can say, "You're absolutely right, I am." He's not worried about what other people think. And then the last thing is that what it results in is that he never stops running. He never stops carrying the gospel forth. All right. Blessings to you all. Happy Easter. And I will see you next week.